In the midst of all of this, huge deficit, huge national debt, the Republican proposal to slash programs that working families, middle-class people desperately need, in the middle of all this, our Republican friends have another brilliant idea. Let's give $1 trillion in tax breaks to the very wealthiest people in this country. Yeah, we're going to throw millions off of Medicaid. We're going to cut back on Pell Grants. We're going to make savage cuts in nutrition programs. And when we get all of those savings, that $1 trillion in savings, you know what we're going to do with it? We're going to give it to the richest people in this country. We're going to lower the tax rate, personal income tax rate for the rich from 35 to 25%. At a time when major corporations like General Electric, ExxonMobil make billions of dollars in profit, pay nothing in federal income taxes, you know what we're going to do to them? We're going to give them even more tax breaks. Now, Madam President, the President has recently come up with an approach toward deficit reduction, which is certainly a lot better than the Republican approach, but to my mind is by no means as strong as it should be. And I was disturbed, not happy to hear that his approach calls for $2 in spending cuts and only $1 in additional revenue. So at a time of significant, severe recession, millions of people are hurting. President is calling for $2 in cuts in spending, only $1 in additional revenue. I think that that's a bad idea. I think that's an inadequate idea, because if the President starts at that position, $2 in spending cuts, $1 in revenue, by the time you deal with the Republicans in the House, that number's going to go up. It'll probably end up 3, 4 to 1 in terms of spending cuts. Senator Ken Conrad, chairman of the Budget Committee here in the Senate, has done a better job, has not gone anywhere near as far as I think he should go, but has at least come up with a budget that I think most Americans think is sensible, in saying, at the very least, let's have $1 of spending cuts and $1 of additional revenue. Let's at least have shared sacrifice. Let's not balance the budget on the backs of the weak and vulnerable. Madam President, let me my office put together just a list of ideas that are out there as to how we can raise revenue in a fair and progressive manner. And I want to just touch on them for a second. Number one, I want everybody to hear this. If we imposed a 5.4 surtax on millionaires who have been doing phenomenally well, over a 10-year period, we can raise $383 billion. Well, what do you think? We can throw millions of people off of Medicaid. We can end nutrition programs for low-income kids, or we can ask the wealthiest people to pay a little bit more. Madam President, the cause of this recession that we're in right now has to do with the greed, the recklessness, and illegal behavior on Wall Street. The crooks on Wall Street who made huge sums of money ended up driving this country into a terrible recession. If we passed a speculation fee, a fee on Wall Street speculators, we could raise as much as $100 billion a year, and, by the way, have the added benefit of cutting back on speculation. We could raise more than $580 billion over 10 years by ending tax breaks for companies that ship jobs overseas. Right now, we have a tax policy that says, hey, shut down a plant in America, go to China, and guess what? You're going to get a tax break. I think that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Madam President, the estate tax, which my Republican friends refer to as the so-called death tax, only applies to the top 0.3%, the very, very, very wealthiest people in this country. Instead of lowering the estate tax, as we recently did, we could raise $330 billion over 10 years by establishing a responsible estate tax that asks the top 0.3% of Americans who inherit over $3.5 million in wealth to pay a fair estate tax. Madam President, we could raise $736 billion over 10 years by taxing capital gains and dividends as ordinary income. Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest people in the world, has said that he pays a lower federal tax rate than his secretary, than do nurses and police officers and teachers, because most of his income and most of the income of very wealthy people is generated by capital gains. Our provision could correct that problem, taxing capital gains and dividends as ordinary income. Madam President, we could raise $40 billion over the next 10 years by ending tax breaks and subsidies for big oil and gas. And I do understand there is legislation going to be coming to the floor, which I strongly support. Doesn't go as far as I would go, but it basically says to the top 5 oil companies who have made huge billions and billions of dollars in profits, now charging us $4 a gallon. Prices are soaring despite the fact that supply today is greater than it was a year ago and demand is less, that maybe we do away with some of the tax breaks that they have enjoyed. $40 billion over 10 years is what I would propose that we can get. We could raise $100 billion a year by prohibiting abusive and illegal offshore tax shelters. Senate Budget Committee has a photograph of a building in the Cayman Islands. It's an infamous building. It's a 4-story building that houses 18,000 corporations. That's right. One building, 18,000 corporations. Obviously, the whole thing is a scam. This is just being used as a postal address for corporations and wealthy individuals who want to avoid paying taxes to the United States government. We estimate, the Budget Committee estimates, that we're losing about $100 billion a year by having corporations and wealthy people stash their money in the Cayman Islands. Now, that's a lot of money, $100 billion a year. Madam President, we could raise up to $500 billion over 10 years by establishing a currency manipulation fee and, by the way, create up to 1 million new jobs in the process. So what is my point? My point, Madam President, is that this deficit was caused by actions voted upon by many of my Republican friends, the war, tax breaks for the rich, Medicare Part D, that in the middle of a recession, when the middle class and working families are already hurting, when poverty is increasing, it is not only immoral, it is bad economics to balance the budget on working families and the most vulnerable people in this country. When people are hurting, when they've lost their jobs, when their incomes are going down, you don't say to those people, we're throwing you off of Medicaid, we're going to voucherize Medicare, we're going to cut back on federal aid to education so your kid can't go to college. That's not what you say in a humane and fair society. On the other hand, at the same time when the wealthiest people are becoming phenomenally wealthier, and when large corporations are making huge profits, and in many cases not paying any taxes at all, it is appropriate to say to those people, sorry, you are also Americans. You have got to participate in shared sacrifice. You have also got to help us reduce the deficit. So that is where we are right now. We're in the midst of a major debate, but it's not only on financial issues. It is very much a philosophical debate. It's a debate about which side are you on. Do you continue to give tax breaks to the very rich and make savage cuts for working families, the children, the elderly, the poor, the most vulnerable? So, Madam President, I am going to continue doing everything that I can to make sure that the budget that is finally passed here in the Senate is a fair budget, is a responsible budget, is a just budget.